Under the oak tree. After a busy few days, the renovations finally came to an end. Maxi and the servants thoroughly inspected the great hall, which had transformed beyond recognition. An enormous golden chandelier illuminated the once gloomy hall. Under it, a striking crimson and gold carpet covered the floor. A soft rug ran up the staircase to the second floor, leading to the lavish banquet hall that would have put even the royal palace to shame. Maxi stood at the entrance of the spacious banquet hall and looked around in awe. Sleek marble tiles had replaced the stone floors, and 3 silver chandeliers shimmered below its high-arched ceiling. The wall was adorned with a tapestry depicting Waiguru's ascent to heaven, and deep burgundy curtains were draped over the windows. Chairs covered in silks and furs stood atop the dais, and on the terrace outside the window, a marble unicorn stood frozen mid-leap. "Is everything to your liking, my lady?" Audeiron asked apprehensively. Maxi nodded, brushing her fingers against the glistening windows. Sunlight streamed in through the glass and illuminated the entire hall. "It's splendid." Seeing Audeiron's face break into a satisfied grin, Maxi found herself smiling as well. He had been a rather aggressive salesman, but he was also honest. He had procured high-quality goods for her at reasonable prices and supplied her with diligent workers. "The castle is practically unrecognizable. Sir Riftan will be surprised when he returns." Maxi turned around to see Ruth walking down the stairs while scratching his unkempt ashen hair. "Do you think Riftan will like it?" Maxi asked nervously. "Why wouldn't he? He was the one who asked you to redecorate the place." Ruth's indifference did little to assuage Maxi's worries. She looked at him resentfully as he gave an undignified yawn. "Would it hurt you to give a compliment?" "The place is so dazzling that I can hardly open my eyes. The splendor is enough to put me in a trance." Maxi glared at Ruth. Ignoring her, Ruth gave himself a good stretch before striding past her. Then suddenly, he came to a stop as if he had remembered something. He looked back at Maxi and the servants. "This might be the perfect time," he muttered, pulling out a small vial from his pocket. "I've just finished making the reagent for the tree. Would you like to test it out?" That was quick. "I was so preoccupied with this that I haven't been able to sleep for days." His appearance, however, clearly suggested that he had just rolled out of bed. And having regularly witnessed him sleeping on the library floor, Maxi was stunned by his brazenness. But knowing that he had been of immeasurable help, she simply nodded. Ruth turned around to go outside. He walked straight to the large tree next to the pavilion and stood under its branches. "Oh, great merciful God of Earth, we beseech you, stretch your healing hands and fill this humble servant with your power." Maxi rolled her eyes. Hierarchs had visited her countless times since childhood to heal her whenever she suffered her father's cruel abuse. She was well aware that mages were able to use magic through simple runes or incantations, and that such lengthy invocations were unnecessary. But when she noticed the servants looking on in awe, she suddenly understood Ruth's intentions. He was trying to show that they had done their utmost to save the tree. Maxi watched from his side as he unscrewed the vial and poured its mysterious contents onto the roots of the tree. Ruth dramatically extended his arms toward the heavens as if he were being granted some special power, then lowered them again and clasped his hands in prayer. Maxi tried not to laugh at the spectacle. Soon, however, she noticed a faint light collecting around Ruth. She stared in amazement as the light began to form a small sphere. With the exception of the hierarch's visits, she had never witnessed magic from such a close distance. The soft light flowing from Ruth's hands danced in the air before enveloping the tree, and the ghastly tree slowly began to absorb the light. Spellbound, Maxi reached out to touch the warm light. The moment her fingers made contact, the light began seeping into her hand. She pulled her hand back, startled. Ruth, who had seen the whole sequence, looked at her in surprise. "That's unexpected," he said, lowering his arms. The tree had finished absorbing the light. Ruth touched its trunk as if to confirm something before turning to look at Maxi again. "It seems you have some mana affinity, my lady." Mana affinity? It's the primary requirement for anyone who wants to learn magic. Maxi's eyes widened in surprise. She blinked and stared at her hands. Did he mean to say that she had a gift for magic? Ruth shrugged before adding, "It's just the basic requisite. The way agile people are better suited for swordsmanship. That alone isn't enough to make someone a sorcerer." "I see." Maxi's shoulders slumped. Of course. How could she expect to be capable of such an incredible ability? Seeing her disappointment, Ruth smiled faintly. "But it is a rare talent. You're quite full of surprises, my lady." "What do you mean?" "You're surprisingly short-tempered, prone to exaggeration, competitive, and now, mana affinity." Maxi's face flushed with embarrassment, but Ruth grinned and continued. "I thought you were just a feeble, demure lady when we first met, but you're proving to be quite interesting." That didn't sound like a compliment. "It was," Ruth said, a smug smile on his face. Skeptical that a true compliment would sound so sardonic, Maxi began to prod the roots of the tree with her foot. "Anyway, did we succeed in reviving the tree?" "I can't say for sure." "How can you not know? What had that grand display been for?" Maxi scowled, but Ruth only shrugged. "All I did was infuse the tree with the earth's mana. We'll have to wait for spring to see the results. If it starts to grow leaves again, it means the magic has worked. If not, then it means it's hopeless and the tree should be cut down." Surveying the bleak garden, she thought about the plans she had discussed with the gardener. If the tree was still dead come spring, she intended to replace it with bright flowers and a sapling, regardless of anyone's objection. With the renovations complete, winter preparations began in earnest at Calyp's castle. With barely a moment's rest, servants covered the well with thick wooden planks to prevent the water from freezing, repaired the partitions in the stables, and stocked enough hay and firewood to last the winter. Meanwhile, the maidservants washed linens and garments until their hands swelled, cleaned every room in the castle, and wove at the loom. They were tasked with finishing winter garments for the guards before the weather turned too cold. Seeing the strain on everyone, Ludys cautiously suggested, "My lady, I'm not sure that we can prepare all the garments on time. May I suggest purchasing some of the fabric instead of weaving it ourselves?" Maxi readily agreed. She could see that everyone was overworked. "How much should I order?" "About half the required amount. We've already prepared the rest." Maxi eyed the pile of fabric in the corner. If she failed to put in a precise order, she was sure to hear an earful from the meddling sorcerer. She grabbed a piece of parchment to calculate the total volume of fabric required for the guards and the quantity of fabric that had already been woven. "Will this suffice?" "Yes, my lady. And if we could also order more of the leather straps, thread, and needles." "My lady, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have an emergency." Rodrigo came running looking distressed. "What is it?" "A man by the name of Midahas is at our gates with 30 knights. He claims to be a nobleman from Southern Livadon, but has no identification to prove it." Midahas? Maxi frowned. The name was unfamiliar. Livadon lay to the west and was an ally of Whedon, and as such it was the kingdom that Whedon interacted with the most. But the nobles of Whedon did not necessarily know the names of Livadonian nobles. Maxi, who had led a cloistered life at Croiso Castle, could hardly be expected to know them. Did he say why he was here? "He says he's come all this way to meet the Lord of Anatole and offer his friendship." "Then can't we just let him in?" "My lady, we cannot let armed men into our land without confirming their identity first. Rodrigo said in an unusually stern tone. "It is a precaution in case anyone attempts to pillage our land while the Lord is away." The color drained from Maxi's face. Who would dare pillage the land under the Remdragon Knights' protection? "We can never be sure, my lady," Ruth interjected with a grim look on his face. "Everyone in the continent knows that our knights are at the capital attending the victory celebrations. It's suspicious that they're visiting us while the Lord is away." Maxi felt nauseous. "Do you also think they're here to attack us?" "It's certainly possible. As the hero of the Dragon campaign, Sir Riftan received a large portion of the treasure found in the dragon's lair. Those blinded by greed might try to steal it, even at the risk of making an enemy of the Remdragon Knights. Will we have to fight them then?" "If he continues to be unreasonable, but he has 30 knights with him." Ruth frowned before continuing. "If these men are real knights, they'll be difficult to deal with. Even a low-ranking knight is worth 10 sentries, so if there's a high-ranking knight among them, there's going to be trouble." Maxi swallowed hard. Ruth seemed to be anticipating a full-blown confrontation. Matters get worse if this man really is a Livadonian noble. He might take offense at us refusing him entry and use his political influence to retaliate, or even start an armed conflict. The ceasefire may have stopped the war among the 7 kingdoms, but we continue to see petty conflicts among the nobility. Then what should we do? What would you like to do, my lady? Ruth asked back, his gaze firm. Maxi flinched and hunched her shoulders. As lady of the castle, it was her duty to keep Anatole safe in Riftan's absence. To her horror, her teeth were chattering. Maxi bit her lips and tried to regain her composure. "I'll go to the gates and try talking to him myself. I'll decide what to do after I've determined who these people are." "Yes, I think that's a good idea," Ruth agreed readily. "I'll accompany you. And in case this escalates, we should bring the castle guards with us. Rodrigo, go inform Sir Oberon and Sir Sabrique of the situation." "Right away," Rodrigo said before sprinting away. "Come with me, my lady." Ruth began to walk away. Maxi handed the parchment in her hands to an attendant and rushed after him. When she finally reached the garden, she saw Keenal approaching with 2 horses. Ruth quickly took the reins from him. With the help of a servant, Maxi clambered onto the lean brown mare. She had to grip the reins and press her thighs against the saddle to keep herself from falling. Satisfied by her performance, Ruth mounted his own horse. Swiftly led them out of the gates. Ruth galloped after them, signaling with his head for Maxi to follow. She trailed behind them as they crossed the drawbridge, the pounding of hooves making her heart race. Maxi followed the guards down a steep hill and across the bustling town below. She was terrified, never having ridden at such speed before. Her hands shook as she gripped the reins as tightly as she could. Her anxiety only grew stronger as she galloped through the grove that she had visited with Riftan not so long prior. She clenched her teeth to avoid biting her tongue. "You're here." Ruth and Sir Oberon leaped off their horses. One of the guards stationed above the gates rushed out to meet them. "Where is this man who claims to be a Livadonian noble?" "He's just outside the gates." This way, my lady." Maxi followed the men up the rampart on stiff legs. Once she reached the battlement, she saw 30 young men on horseback. Their faces were tanned, and they were dressed in heavy robes with a long sword at each of their waists. Ruth looked down and addressed them loudly. "Which among you is the nobleman?" "It is I, Rob Midahas," the man on the chestnut horse answered. Maxi peered at the speaker. He had light golden brown hair and a bulky frame, and he appeared to be in his mid-30s. He squinted and stared straight up at Ruth. "Are you the Lord of Anatole?" "I am a mere servant. Our Lady is here on behalf of the Lord." Ruth calmly pointed to Maxi, who was standing next to him. When the stranger's sharp gaze fell on her, she instinctively took a step back. The man curled the corners of his lips into a sneer. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm sure you've been informed that I am Midahas, the Lord of Kaisa, an estate in Western Livadon. I come to befriend the Remdragon Knights after hearing about their victory over the dragon. I hope you'll welcome me in." Maxi glanced at Ruth, but he remained standing with his arms crossed. He plainly had no intention of answering the man. Trying to loosen her rigid tongue, Maxi slowly opened her mouth to speak. "I heard. You have nothing to prove your identity. I cannot allow unidentified individuals to enter. We lost them on our journey here. Your cleric can confirm my identity once you let us in. Anatole does not welcome unidentified guests. This is our Lord's command, and we cannot defy his orders. Come back when you have new identification." The man furrowed his brows and answered in an irritated voice. "I can't understand a word you're saying. Let me speak to someone who can talk properly." Maxi blanched at the blatant insult. She froze, but Ruth soon stepped in front of her as if to defend her. "You're speaking to the Lady of Anatole. Mind your manners." "I only spoke the truth. I can't understand her." Maxi clutched at her robe, suppressing the urge to flee. She mustered all her courage to speak once more. "As I've said, come back when you have your identifications with you. I will not open the gates. We passed through monster lairs to reach Anatole, and you want us, weary travelers, to turn back without rest." The man's voice grew more menacing and his attitude more domineering. Maxi shrank back, her lips trembling. With a furious look on his face, the man began to shout even more loudly. "Is the Lady of Anatole so uncharitable? I will return with hundreds of knights if you deny me entry now. I won't forget this insult. Without identifications, I cannot. Your cleric can confirm my identity. I've said that already." As the man's demeanor continued to grow more threatening, a familiar sense of dread paralyzed Maxi. Cold sweat trickled down her forehead. Seeing Maxi shake, Ruth intervened. "Stop being so unreasonable. Don't blame us when you're the ones who lost your identification. Do you expect us to allow 30 armed men into our land? Ha! Is Anatole so weak they can't let 30 men enter? I see that without their lord, Anatole is a mere den of cowards. How dare you?" Sir Oberon, who had been trying to contain his anger, drew his sword as he yelled in outrage. "Ruth, open the gates. I'll cut off that arrogant bastard's head." "Sir Oberon." Ruth turned to give the old knight an admonishing look, then immediately spun around again and stretched his hands into the air. But it was too late. A massive flame hurtled toward the gate with a tremendous roar and hit it with a thud. The rampart shook violently. Maxi shrieked and gripped the nearest wall while the guards retreated in confusion. Midahas unsheathed his own sword. "You want my head? I'd like to see you try." Maxi sank to the floor. Ruth quickly collected himself and pulled her up by the arm to lead her down the rampart. Maxi stifled a scream when she saw that the flames had smashed through the towering gate, allowing Midahas Knights to rush in. "Shield!" Ruth yelled, his hand outstretched. Gusts of blue wind created a barrier that blocked the knights. But before long, one of the knights shattered the barrier with a swing of his sword. "He's a high-ranking knight. Sir Oberon, leave it to me." Sir Oberon jumped down from the rampart, roaring at the trespassing knights as he swung his massive sword. The sound of clashing metal pierced the air. Maxi tried to run faster, but her foot caught on a rock and she tripped. "My lady." Ruth turned back to look at her, but he was too busy creating a barrier to help. Just a few steps away, Sir Oberon was locked in a fierce battle with the intruders. Ruth and the guards were trying their best to keep the black-robed knights at bay. Anatolians who had come to see what the commotion was about fled in terror when they realized what was happening. Finally, a guard helped Maxi to her feet, and Ruth called out to her, "My lady, take shelter. But please get out of here. There's nothing you can do." Ruth suddenly stopped yelling. Maxi felt a sudden shift in the air. She looked up to see one of the guards on the rampart lowering his bow and shouting something. "The Remdragon Knights are here. The Lord has returned." An icy silence swept across the grounds. Just moments ago, the intruders had been charging at the gates, but they were now looking behind them in disbelief. Knights clad in silver armor were thundering down the hill toward them. When Maxi saw the man at the fore, she sank to the ground in relief. She kept her gaze focused on Riftan, who looked capable of overcoming any obstacle without fear.